All right, Ninja Nerds, in this video today, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus. We're going to cover the basic anatomy first, then the basic function of the hypothalamus. Then what we'll do is we'll dig into the nitty-gritty, talk about the different nuclei, really expand on the overall functions of the hypothalamus, and then have a little bit of a conversation on the pathways or connections between the hypothalamus and other structures and their relevance. All right, so let's go and get started. All right, Ninja Nerds, so let's start talking about the basic anatomy of the hypothalamus. Really what I want you more to understand, rather than going into all the details on the neuroanatomy, is to know that the hypothalamus is a part of a structure in the brain, deep within the cerebrum, a gray matter structure called the diencephalon. That's the big thing I want you to know. So it's a component of what's called the diencephalon. Now that leads us to the question that the diencephalon, it's kind of a cluster of gray matter deep within the cerebrum, right? Well, there's a bunch of different structures that actually make up the diencephalon, and that's what I want you guys to really focus on. So, the epicenter of the diencephalon is actually this blue structure here. You see this blue egg-like structure here? This blue egg-like structure here is called the thalamus. This thalamus is kind of the center of the diencephalon, and all the other names of the components of the diencephalon are named based upon the position related to it. So one of the components of the diencephalon here is the thalamus. That's the big one, right? The second one, what we're going to do is we're going to take the thalamus and we're going to move posterior, right? So if you go posterior, so this is the anterior portion of this diencephalon, this is the posterior portion of the diencephalon. So here in the posterior portion, you have this pink-like gland on the back of it. You know what? I'm sorry, purple gland. I'm going colorblind. The purple gland on the back here, this is called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland, with a couple other structures. What other structures? Well, really, if we wanted to, there's kind of like, I can draw like a little asterisk there. There's what's called the habenula, right? And then you have another structure called the habenular commissure. And then you have this other structure back here called the posterior commissure. But really, the posterior commissure, the habenula, and the pineal gland make up what's called the epithalamus. So let's write that down. Epithalamus is another component of the diencephalon. And what are the things that makes it? It is the pineal gland. And it is the habenula. And it is the posterior commissure. Beautiful. So we understand two parts of the diencephalon, thalamus, epithalamus. Okay, now let's move a little bit just kind of inferior, just a little bit inferior, maybe even a little bit posterior to the thalamus. You see this red structure, this kind of maroon colored structure here, just kind of inferior to the thalamus. This right here is called the subthalamus. This is called the subthalamus. This is another important component of the diencephalon. The last component, which is actually what we're going to be talking about primarily here. I'm going to shade it in here in green. All of this area here that I'm shading in, that's anterior and inferior to the thalamus. What is this called? The hypothalamus. So this is the hypothalamus. And these are the main components of our diencephalon. Now, a couple other just anatomical things that you should know because it's clinically relevant. Here you have your hypothalamus, right? There's these little things that are it's a part of the hypothalamus, but it's a little nucleus, a little nugget hanging off of it. You see this thing here, this kind of like little boob structure here hanging off? That's called your mammillary bodies. We'll talk about this in more detail, but it's actually a part of the hypothalamus. The other thing that's really important here, you see these things here, these hanging off of the hypothalamus. This is your pituitary gland. So this is called your pituitary gland. This is another important structure that's associated with the hypothalamus. One more that's really important. You see this structure here that's kind of it actually crosses. You have your optic nerves. They're moving backwards. As they move backwards, they cross, called the optic chiasma. That happens just around the area of the hypothalamus. So this right here is called the optic chiasma. So it's kind of important here to understand some of these things. One other thing, just to kind of define the borders here. You see you have this thing here coming down from the corpus callosum. Here's your corpus callosum, right? You have this structure coming down here. This here is actually important. It's called the lamina terminalis. It's called the lamina terminalis. It just kind of gives you the border of this hypothalamus. And then really this little nugget here is called the anterior commissure. Okay? But the basic thing I want you to know, taking away from the anatomy, is that the hypothalamus is one of the 4 components of the diencephalon. Now, what I want to do is to take this portion of the hypothalamus, cut it out, and zoom on it a little bit more so we can talk about the zones of the hypothalamus and the nuclei that occupy it. All right, so the next thing that we need to do here is that we're going to zoom in on the hypothalamus, okay? So you kind of have, again, that anterior border. That's why I kind of mentioned it was that lamina terminalis and the anterior commissure. And then here you have your optic chiasma, right? The other thing here is that we have this kind of, remember how I told you this is coming into the pituitary gland? Well, this here, imagine this is like a large funnel, right? Here's this kind of like large funnel shaped portion here. This actually has a special name. Sometimes they like to ask this on exam. It's called the tuber cinereum. And what happens is the tuber cinereum will start narrowing. Is going to be called the infundibulum. Okay, and then it obviously extends downwards into your pituitary gland. All right, good. Now the next part here is that we have 4 zones that I need us to know because there's nuclei in each one of these zones. The first one here, the first zone, okay? This first zone is called the preoptic zone. This is called the preoptic zone. There's 1 nucleus present within the preoptic zone. We're going to abbreviate it for now, but we'll actually write it out in more detail later. But this is called the medial preoptic nucleus. Okay, so the preoptic zone is the most anterior portion, only made up of 1 nucleus, which is the medial preoptic nucleus. The second zone here is actually very important. Lots of nuclei in this one. It's called the supraoptic zone. And in the supraoptic zone, there's tons of nuclei. One of these nuclei is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus is one. You know, another one is called the supraoptic nucleus. That's another one. Then above that is the paraventricular nucleus. And then lastly, very important one here, is the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. Okay? So you have the preoptic zone, the supraoptic zone. Move a little bit posterior. You have your third zone here. This third zone is called the tuberal zone. It's called the tuberal zone. So you have preoptic, anterior, supraoptic, and then tuberal zone is the third posterior portion. Because again, we're going anterior to posterior here. The nuclei in here, there's 3 nuclei here. One of them is actually called the arcuate nucleus. We're going to put ARC. This one's a monster, does tons of functions. We'll get into detail on that one. Then you have a nucleus which is actually located more anterior or ventral. So we call this the ventromedial nucleus. Then you have one that's a little bit more dorsally. So this is called your dorsal medial nucleus. Okay? So we have the preoptic, supraoptic, tuberal, the last and final zone. Remember that structure I told you that these little things are hanging off of the hypothalamus towards the back? It's called the mammillary bodies, right? We told you that that was a part of the hypothalamus. Well, this zone here, thankfully, is called the mammillary zone. And the mammillary zone is actually made up of 2 primary nuclei. One is called the mammillary nuclei, right? And the last one, which is a very important one here, is called the posterior hypothalamic nucleus. Beautiful. Now there's one last thing that I have to mention here just really quickly because you can't see this other part of the hypothalamus. If you imagine here that we have, like, this is the third ventricle. On both sides of the third ventricle, you have kind of this sheet of gray matter, right? So here's our third ventricle, right, with the dots. On the sides here is the hypothalamus. Well, there's actually 2 parts of the hypothalamus, the medial portion and the lateral portion. What we're looking at here, we're only seeing the medial portion. We don't see the lateral portion, which is actually kind of, if I were to punch my hand through this wall, it'd be behind this. okay? So there's one last nucleus that I need you guys to remember, and it's actually, so we already talked about all the nuclei here in the medial, right? And imagine this is anterior to posterior. So you'd have your preoptic, your supraoptic, your tuberal, your mammillary. There's one nucleus all the way lateral, and this is very simple, thankfully. It's called the lateral hypothalamic nucleus, and it actually extends almost the entire length of all the zones that we talked about in the medial portion of the hypothalamus, which is the preoptic, supraoptic, tuberal, and mammillary. Beautiful. Okay. Now, the last thing that we have to talk about here, since we've established the basic anatomy, okay, and the basic kind of zones and nuclei, is the functions. What is the basic functions? If you had to boil down the functions of the hypothalamus, you know what I like to do? I like to think about it in 3 functions. So if someone were to ever ask me, what's the functions of the hypothalamus? I could tell them 3 things. 1 is it's involved with our autonomic nervous system. What does this mean? That means it has the ability to either work with the sympathetic to speed us up, fight or flight, parasympathetic, slow us down, rest, digest. We'll talk about how. It also is a part of our endocrine system. It's our master endocrine regulator. So it's involved with a lot of hormone production. Okay, we'll see about how that happens later. And the last thing that it's actually really important for is the limbic system. It's actually one of the epicenters of the limbic system. Very important for the limbic system. Okay? So, if someone asks you 3 basic functions of the hypothalamus, you say autonomic, endocrine, limbic. Let's go ahead and get into the details now. All right, engineers, so now let's start talking in detail. Remember I told you that there was 3 basic functions, right? Limbic, autonomic, endocrine. Well, when we talk about limbic, obviously we could just say, oh, it's involved in the limbic system. But we should know a little bit more, expand on that a little bit. So what is the limbic system responsible for, right? If I were to ask you, what is the limbic system responsible for? I want you to remember it's involved in emotions. And when I talk about emotions, what am I talking about? I'm talking about fear, aggression, anger, right? It's also involved with sexual behaviors, okay? So sexual behaviors, preferences. It's also involved in feeding behaviors as well. So satiety, hunger. And it's also involved in learning and memory. So when we talk about the limbic system, I really want you to remember that it's involved in memory, learning, your emotions, and sexual and feeding behaviors. So now let's talk about how it's involved in that. The main one that's really kind of involved with this is these mammillary bodies. So you see this part here, I'm going to draw a dot there and this little thing coming off here. That's our mammillary bodies. Now the mammillary bodies, we kind of touched on this when we talked about the thalamus. The mammillary bodies are important because they have 2 primary functions. One is, again, they're involved in this limbic system, but one of the big things that it's involved with is memory consolidation. So it's involved with our memory. Particularly the type of memory is episodic memory. But it also has an involvement, reflex particularly, maybe some type of reflex with olfaction. What is olfaction? Smell. So there might be some type of involvement of this structure with this memory behind smells. All right, so I want you to remember that it's involved with episodic memory and particularly maybe even memory, reflexive memory is involved with smells. Okay, how? We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty here, but I want you guys to remember that the mammillary bodies are connected to a couple structures here. Do you guys remember there's a structure here called the fornix? You guys know this structure, this orange structure here? What is this orange structure here called? It's called the hippocampus, right? It's called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus has this structure here called the fornix. And the fornix is this kind of white matter structure here that moves all the way around here and then connects to the what? Mammillary bodies. And then do you guys remember what the tract is called between? So here, what is this structure here called? This orange structure here, this is called your fornix. Then there's actually the next connection, which is between the mammillary bodies and the nucleus of the thalamus. Do you remember what nucleus of the thalamus this is? I know you guys know. It's the anterior thalamic nucleus, right? Anterior thalamic nucleus. And this connection between the mammillary bodies and the anterior thalamic nucleus is called what? It's called the mammillothalamic tract. Mammillary bodies, thalamus. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Then, from the anterior thalamic nucleus, it works its way up to the cingulate gyrus. And then from the cingulate gyrus, it works its way down eventually back to the hippocampus. What did we say that we started with the hippocampus and ended with the hippocampus? What was the name of this circuit that we talked about with the thalamus? Do you guys remember? It's called Papay's circuit. So it's called Papay's circuit. And if you guys remember, Papay's circuit is involved with memory. Damage of Papay's circuit can result in conditions like Alzheimer's, and it can also result in conditions such as Wernicke's encephalopathy, right? The other connection, remember I told you that the hypothalamus has many different functions, right? Limbic functions is one of them. Well, guess what? You know there's another structure here sitting kind of just on top of the hippocampus here? It's called the amygdala. So what is this structure here called? It's called the amygdala. The amygdala is involved with fear, anger, aggression, olfaction. And this can connect from the amygdala. There's some pathways here that can connect to the hypothalamus and actually some specifically the mammillary bodies. Do you know what this pathway is called? It's called the stria terminalis. We'll talk more in detail when we get over there to the connections, but for right now we're just going to abbreviate it as ST, stria terminalis. There is another small pathway. We're not going to get into detail, but it does connect the amygdala to the hypothalamus, a real short one called the ventral amygdalofugal pathway. I just want you to know that the way that we connect the hypothalamus via the mammillary bodies to the limbic system is via the fornix to the hippocampus and the stria terminalis to the amygdala. And this whole circuitry that the mammillary bodies are involved in for memory is called Papay's circuit. Okay. All right, that's the first thing, the mammillary bodies. Now we got to talk about some other nuclei. The other nuclei that are somewhat involved with the limbic system, because remember what I told you the limbic system is involved with, emotions, right? So fear, anger, aggression, also motivation, drive, feeding behaviors. You know, there's a nucleus here called the arcuate nucleus. Remember we abbreviated ARC, the arcuate nucleus? The arcuate nucleus receives signals from different parts of the body. But here's where it's important. The arcuate nucleus has connections to two other nuclei that we talked about in the tuberal zone. One of them is called your ventral medial nucleus of the hypothalamus. And the other one we talked about is the one that you couldn't really see, but it was making up the whole lateral portion of the hypothalamus. This is called the lateral hypothalamic nucleus. Now, the arcuate nucleus can actually modulate the activity of these two centers by the types of neuropeptides it releases. If the arcuate nucleus releases certain types of peptides, alpha, melanocyte stimulating hormone, and cocaine amphetamine regulating transcripts, this modulates the activity of the ventral medial nucleus, right? So it may stimulate it. So the ventral medial nucleus, when acted on by these neuropeptides, will release a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone. And when this hormone is released, it induces satiety. So what I want you to associate ventral medial nucleus with is satiety, Sitter. What does that mean, satiety? It makes you feel full, right? So the ventral medial nucleus is involved with satiety. The arcuate nucleus can also release certain types of neuropeptides that act on the lateral hypothalamic nucleus, such as what? Neuropeptide Y and agouti regulating peptide. And this can stimulate these nuclei and stimulate these nuclei to release what's called orexins. And orexins, when released, induce hunger. I feel like this is always activated in my body. So this is kind of the involvements. When I want you to remember is ventral medial nucleus, satiety center. Lateral hypothalamic nucleus, hunger center. All right, so now that we understand the basic functions of these two centers, now what I want to do is talk about how these centers can be modulated from different types of hormones and food within the GIT. So let's come down here for a second. All right, so now what I want us to know is not just the fact that this is the satiety center for ventral medial and hunger center for lateral hypothalamic, but how they're influenced by different types of hormones and actual chemical factors and stretch signals. We'll talk about that. So you know within our adipose tissue, whenever we have an increase in fat storage, right? Whenever there's an increase in our fat storage, so sometimes what I have a lot of, this increase in fat storage will stimulate your adipocytes, their fat cells, to release a hormone called leptin. And leptin is very interesting because leptin tries to basically induce satiety, so you don't keep eating more food and getting fatter, okay? So that's one hormone that I want you to remember. The next one is your pancreas. Whenever you have really high glucose levels, okay, so really high glucose levels, what that does is that stimulates your pancreatic beta cells. And your pancreatic beta cells make a hormone called insulin. And insulin is basically going to, again, try to induce satiety because you don't want to increase your glucose levels even more. You've already eaten. The last thing here is whenever you have food within your gastrointestinal tract, right? So let's say that there's food here within the gastrointestinal tract. It's going to distend the GIT, right? So maybe it distends the small intestine. And whenever you distend that portion of the small intestine, remember we have nerves. Remember what nerve is actually coupled with the GIT that responds to stretch? Do you guys remember which nerve that is? That is your vagus nerve, so cranial nerve 10. So the vagus nerve will send signals up to your hypothalamus. Insulin can send signals to your hypothalamus. And leptin can also send signals to your hypothalamus. Okay? So whenever there is stretching, so we'll put here stretch. Okay, that's going to activate the vagus nerve. There's one more hormone that we have to mention. I don't want to get it confused here, so we're going to draw it here in pink. There's another hormone that's made by your stomach whenever you are fasting. Okay? What does that mean? You're not eating. And this hormone is called ghrelin. And ghrelin will also go and act on the hypothalamus. So now, let's come back up here for a second and see how all of these hormones regulate the activity of these satiety and hunger centers. All right, so now what I want you to think about here is satiety, right, and hunger for these two centers. If we take leptin on both sides, leptin is released whenever there's increasing fat storage. So do you want to activate the satiety center if you already have a lot of fat storage? Yes, because you don't want to continue to keep eating and eating and eating more food and building up fat storage. So the leptin should stimulate the ventromedial nucleus, right? Insulin. Insulin is released whenever there's high glucose levels. So that probably means that you've already eaten. If you've already eaten and your blood glucose levels are high, do you want to keep eating more and actually increasing your glucose levels? No, you should induce satiety. So insulin should do what? It should stimulate this area of the ventromedial nucleus so that you induce satiety. What about the vagus nerve whenever there's lots of stretch? If there's a lot of food in the GIT, stretching the GIT, then you don't need to be eating anymore and filling up your gullet even more. So what should stretch do via the cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve? That should also stimulate the ventromedial nucleus. And the opposite should be over here. So if you come down to it, leptin should do what to this area? Leptin, insulin, and the vagus nerve should inhibit this nucleus, the lateral hypothalamic nucleus. Insulin should also inhibit the lateral hypothalamic nucleus. And the last thing is your cranial nerve 10, due to the stretch signals, this should also inhibit this nucleus, right? Because you don't want to be hungry. The last thing is this ghrelin. Remember I told you ghrelin is released whenever you're fasted. So you don't have any food in the stomach. So what should that be? Now I got to eat. So ghrelin is going to do what? Ghrelin is going to stimulate the activity of this nucleus and inhibit the activity of this nucleus. Because ghrelin is your hunger hormone. It's a dinner bell to let you know. The last thing here for this entire thing for the limbic is this really simple structure. There really isn't much to it. It's the dorsal medial nucleus. We talked about it before. Really, all I want you to know is that this is involved with certain types of behaviors that are non-specific. And whenever there's damage to this nucleus, sometimes people can develop savage behaviors. All right, so just now to quickly understand, because remember, I want you guys to understand when we're talking about the anatomy and physiology of the hypothalamus, it's not just important just to know this is the structures, this is what they do. You should know those things because if there's damage to this ventromedial nucleus, let's assume that you have destruction of the ventromedial nucleus. Well, what does the ventromedial nucleus is responsible for? Satiety. If you damage the satiety center, you'll never have satiation. You'll never be full. And so because of that, people develop obesity and a term called hyperphagia, which is where they want to eat and shove food down their gullet all the time. Okay? If you think about the other situation, if there's a lesion of the lateral hypothalamic nucleus, this is responsible for hunger. If you damage the hunger center, right? Now you're never going to have this sense of wanting to eat. So because of that, in children, in infants, this is very important. This can lead to what's called FTT, failure to thrive, right? And in some cases, maybe more in the adults, this may be responsible for anorexia nervosa, okay? Damage to the dorsal medial nucleus. This is responsible for certain types of behaviors. If you damage the dorsal medial nucleus, guess what this can lead to? Savage behaviors. And what does that mean? That means you're very cruel, you're very rude, you know? So it leads to a lot of savage behaviors whenever there's damage to the dorsal medial nucleus. And then again, to put into to all the connections here, remember we told you mammillary bodies are very important for memory. If you damage the mammillary bodies, right, it can lead to a particular condition. What is that condition? It's called Wernicke's, right? Or particularly Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff syndrome. So Wernicke's encephalopathy or Korsakoff syndrome. And one of the big things that develops in this is what's called confabulation. And that's basically where these people, they have pieces of their memory that are lost and they fill in those empty spaces with things that are actually not real. That's called confabulation. Okay? So these are the important things that I want you to remember from the limbic function of the hypothalamus. Now let's talk about the endocrine. All right, so now that we've talked about the limbic function, let's talk about the endocrine function. Now we've gone over a lot of this stuff already in our endocrinology playlist, so we're not going to go into tons of detail. We'll cover the basics. First things first, when we talk about the hypothalamus, right? We have already covered some of the structures already. Ventromedial, dorsal medial nucleus, lateral hypothalamic nucleus, and we even talked a little bit about the arcuate nucleus. So let's kind of march out here. We'll start with this, go from left to right, and kind of cover some of these other nuclei here in the hypothalamus. This first one here, this orange one here, is called the arcuate nucleus. Now the arcuate nucleus, I want you to remember this guy as responsible for the releasing factors and inhibiting factors. I'll explain what that means. So the arcuate nucleus is pretty much the site for where you release a lot of the releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Let me explain. The arcuate nucleus has its actual cell body here in the hypothalamus, right? But then the axons extend down towards like the actual tuber cinereum. And what they do is they release specific types of hormones into this portal circulation. And then from this portal circulation connects the hypothalamus to this, the anterior pituitary. So from here, it'll release multiple hormones, and these hormones will then move through the portal system to these different types of cells. So for example, one of the hormones that it makes is called growth hormone releasing hormone. What will that do? Well, that will actually act on specific types of somatotrophic cells and stimulate those somatotrophic cells to release a particular hormone called growth hormone. And you know what growth hormone does. It's involved in stimulating the liver. It acts on the muscles. It acts on bones, cartilage, all the adipocytes. We have more detail on this if you guys want to go watch it in our endocrinology playlist. All right. But on the other side, if you want to inhibit the release of growth hormone, what else would you have? Not just growth hormone releasing hormone, but you would also have another hormone to counteract this, the growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So you have both of these to modulate the activity of growth hormone production. All right, so there's another hormone that the arcuate nucleus releases. It's called corticotropin releasing hormone. And then again, there would be the corticotropin inhibiting hormone. These act on these corticotropic cells in the anterior pituitary and stimulate the anterior pituitary cells to release ACTH. ACTH then acts on the adrenal cortex and stimulates the production of cortisol. And we know that cortisol has many different functions. Okay? So CRH, CIH, they modulate the activity of cortisol eventually. Okay, the next one is going to be, it releases another interesting hormone here. The next hormone it releases is very interesting. This one is actually called prolactin inhibiting hormone. But you know what the prolactin inhibiting hormone really is? It's just dopamine. So we're going to put prolactin inhibiting hormone. And the prolactin inhibiting hormone is really the only main hormone acting on these lactotrophs. But I want you to remember, I'm going to write it here, prolactin inhibiting hormone really is just dopamine. So that activates, actually regulates the activity of these lactotrophs. And then the lactotrophs will release a particular hormone here called prolactin. And prolactin will act where? It'll act on the mammary glands and stimulate the production of milk within the mammary glands. Okay? Okay, next. Another hormone that this actual arcuate nucleus releases is called TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. And the other one will be thyrotropin inhibiting hormone. And these act on the thyrotropes in the anterior pituitary and stimulate the production of a particular hormone called TSH. TSH will then act onto the thyroid gland and stimulate the thyroid gland to make T3 and T4, which collectively are the thyroid hormone. Beautiful. And we know that this has tens of thousands of functions, right? All right, the last one here that's actually really important because we're actually going to that's it for the arcuate nucleus. The other function that I want you guys to know here, another nucleus here, is this purple one. We're going to skip these for just a second. So we covered all the arcuate nucleus. It releases the releasing factors and inhibiting factors for what we just spoke about. The other one here, this purple nucleus over here, more in the anterior portion. This is called your medial preoptic nucleus, right? And this in that preoptic zone. This guy releases a particular hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And it can also release gonadotropin inhibiting hormone. But regardless, this acts on these gonadotrophs. All right, now, the medial preoptic nucleus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone or inhibiting hormones. That can act on the gonadotrophs within the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary will then start releasing what types of hormones? If it's that gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's really the one that's acting there. Do you guys know? The main hormones that it's releasing is FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone can act differently between male and female. In the female, it's responsible for what types of things? It's responsible for estrogen production, right? Particularly from the FSH. And then the LH is important for progesterone production, right? And obviously it's important for the entire reproductive development and secondary sex characteristics. Within the male, FSH is really mainly for sperm production, right? Sperm production. Whereas in the LH within males, it's responsible for testosterone production. So that leads us to this next point here with the medial preoptic nucleus. Because it functions differently between males and females, this nucleus is sometimes referred to as sexually dimorphic. So it's sometimes referred to as a sexually dimorphic nucleus because it functions differently between males and females. Okay, we talked about the medial preoptic nucleus, right? And its involvement primarily with the gonadotropin releasing hormone. We talked about the arcuate nucleus and their involvement with the releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones, right? Now let's talk about these other two nuclei that have endocrine functions. So this one here, this blue one, is called the supraoptic nucleus. So this is called the supraoptic nucleus. And then this maroon colored one here, this guy is called the paraventricular nucleus. This is called the paraventricular nucleus. Now, the supraoptic nucleus actually is very interesting because it responds to two things mainly. Let's actually draw it in pink so we really know that this is the big stimulators. So the supraoptic nucleus can respond to your water balance within the body, right? So what does that mean? So it really can respond to what's called osmolality. Osmolality meaning kind of the solute concentration within the blood. So whenever a patient has decreased water in the blood and high amounts of solutes. Maybe that's sodium, maybe that's glucose, whatever. In these kinds of situations where you have a hypertonic plasma, what that may do is stimulate, okay, your supraoptic nucleus. Another thing that can stimulate the supraoptic nucleus is a hormone that's released, okay? It's actually made through what's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, and it's called angiotensin II. This also can stimulate the supraoptic nucleus. Now, the supraoptic nucleus has its nuclei in the hypothalamus, but its axons extend from the hypothalamus all the way down to the posterior pituitary. So this is anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. It then will release, because it has little vesicles that are storing the hormone here in the terminals. It will release a particular hormone when stimulated. This hormone is called antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also sometimes referred to as vasopressin. ADH, we know that will act on the blood vessels, and it can also act on the kidneys. When it acts on the blood vessels, it induces what's called vasoconstriction. Now, vasoconstriction is important because that can increase the actual resistance within the blood vessel and potentially increase blood pressure. Whereas it acts on the kidneys to increase the water reabsorption. Okay, so it increases water reabsorption, and that can increase blood volume, which can increase your blood pressure. But also, if you increase water reabsorption, guess what else you do? You increase the water in the body. And so that kind of helps to even out, because remember, before the problem was you had low water and high solutes. So you're kind of remedying this by increasing the amount of water for the increased solutes. Okay? So we have that part. Now, the other nucleus here is the paraventricular nucleus. This paraventricular nucleus is actually stimulated by two things. One is actually called suckling. So one is called suckling. So whenever the baby suckles, okay, on the nipple of the mother, that can be one stimulus. The second thing that can be a stimulus here is uterus, the uterine stretch. So whenever a mother is in labor, it can stretch the actual stretch receptors within the uterus, and that can send a reflex up to the paraventricular nucleus. When this stimulates the paraventricular nucleus, the nucleus is in the hypothalamus, but the axons extend all the way down here into the posterior pituitary. Has vesicles here that store the hormone and then releases it based upon the stimulation. This hormone release is called oxytocin. Oxytocin will then act on the uterus to induce uterine contractions. And it'll act on the muscle within the breast around the milk glands and cause milk ejection. So that is the thing I want you to know here for the paraventricular nucleus with oxytocin. Now, there's an important thing, and we'll talk about these over here, but just to give you the name of them. The vascular connection between the arcuate nucleus and the medial preoptic nucleus and the anterior pituitary, this portal system is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. The connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary via these two fibers here, this is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. We'll talk about that a little bit later and remind you guys of that. Okay, so we talked about these nuclei. There's one more nuclei that we got to mention here that's involved with hormone production. All right, the next nucleus here is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus. This one, what I want you to remember is that this is our biological clock. This is our biological clock. That's all I want you to remember. And how that's involved in that is really simple. You have your eye, right? Which has obviously your retina here. When light hits the retina, okay, it can send impulses down the optic nerve. Well, the optic nerve is connected to the suprachiasmatic nucleus via a tract called the retinohypothalamic tract. Regardless of that, light and darkness can then act on the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, through multiple connections, can be eventually connected with the pineal gland. And when it acts on the pineal gland, whenever there's darkness, so whenever there's darkness, this will activate the suprachiasmatic nucleus, who will then stimulate the pineal gland to release a particular hormone here called melatonin. And melatonin is involved in our sleep and wake cycles, right? So the suprachiasmatic nucleus is really, when we talk about it, it's involved with our sleep and wake cycles, right? So our circadian rhythm. So if you have damage to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, what will happen? Man, you will have what? Potentially insomnia. Okay, because this is involved in regulating your sleep and wake cycles. So, suprachiasmatic nucleus, biological clock involved with sleep-wake cycle, damage can result in insomnia. All right, so the last type of activity of the hypothalamus, right? We said the three big functions is limbic, endocrine, and autonomic. So the autonomic functions, it's actually really straightforward. This shouldn't take very long. So remember, we had in the hypothalamus, we had two types of nucleus. I know you guys remember this. So here in blue, this one's obviously more anterior. So we're going to call this the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. All right. Then here in orange, okay, we'll kind of zoom out on this one. The one in orange here, this is called our posterior hypothalamic nucleus. So, what do I want you to know out of this? Let's start here with the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. What I want you to remember is the anterior hypothalamic nucleus is involved with our parasympathetic nervous system. There's two primary functions of the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. The big one I want you to know right now is that it's involved in our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, parasympathetic nervous system. Do you guys remember all the cranial nerve nuclei and the structures within the spinal cord that are involved in your parasympathetic nervous system? I know you guys know. Remember, it's called cranial sacral outflow. So what happens is from the hypothalamus, it has this structure here called the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, that as it comes down from the hypothalamus, it descends all the way down here, right? We're going to keep her going. It's going to come down here, and it can innervate all of the structures. So here in the sacral portion, it can innervate structures within the brainstem, look at that. So many different structures this sucker is innervating. Okay, so let's talk about this. So if it's connecting, if the hypothalamus is connecting to the actual parasympathetic nervous system, you guys got to remember all the cranial nerve nuclei and the level of the sacrospinal cord. So what cranial nerve here in the midbrain is actually involved with pupillary constriction? Cranial nerve 3. So what nucleus is this that it's associated with? The particular nucleus is called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. And again, this is involved with the third cranial nerve, right? So cranial nerve 3, which is involved particularly with the pupillary constriction. Then, if you come down, so not only is this parasympathetic part of the hypothalamus connected with the Edinger-Westphal, but it's also connected with these two nuclei that are involved with salivation. This one is going to be, this nucleus is higher up. So this is the superior salivatory nucleus. So this is called your superior salivatory nucleus. This one is inferior. So this is called your inferior salivatory nucleus. The superior is associated with cranial nerve what? 7. This is facial nerve. And the inferior salivatory nucleus is associated with cranial nerve 9. Glossopharyngeal nerve. Beautiful. Then the last parasympathetic nucleus that it's associated with here is cranial nerve 10, but particularly the dorsal nucleus of vagus. And this is associated obviously with cranial nerve 10. And this is all a part of your parasympathetic cranial nerve nuclei. So you come down here, remember, craniosacral outflow. So here in the sacral spinal cord from S2 to S4, what is this? This is where your preganglionic parasympathetic nervous system neurons are located, particularly the cell bodies are here. And then it'll come out and supply all the sacral area. Okay, so there's many different structures. If you guys want to know that, go watch that in our parasympathetic videos. Okay, now the next thing is it also connects. Not only does this dorsal longitudinal fasciculus connect the anterior hypothalamic nucleus to the cranial nuclei and the sacral nerve nuclei, but it also connects it to this pink structure here, with that expands the entire length of the brainstem. What is this pink structure here called that extends the length of the brainstem? This is called the reticular formation. And this is very, very important with kind of alerting or arousing the cerebral cortex of all sensory types of information. The last aspect here, it's really minute. I don't really want us to get too crazy in it, but there is another thing here. Here in the deep part of the medulla, you have what's called the nucleus of tractus solitarius. Technically, the nucleus of tractus solitarius can send fibers up with this dorsal longitudinal fasciculus that actually go to the anterior hypothalamic nucleus to let them know of all the types of taste sensations, cardiovascular, visceral sensations that are going on. Okay, beautiful. That covers the parasympathetic part. Now we got to cover the sympathetic part. Thankfully, this is very simple. The posterior hypothalamic nucleus has sympathetic fibers. And these sympathetic fibers, they only really go to one place. Thank goodness. Let's descend these guys down here. It's going down, 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 down. And as it goes down, it only stops at one location. These preganglionic sympathetic motor neurons located in what part of the spinal cord? I know you guys know this. This is the T1 to L2. So from T1 all the way to L2, what do you have here? T1 to L2, this is going to be your preganglionic sympathetic nervous system neurons. And this is for that sympathetic types of activity. And this connection between the hypothalamus and the spinal cord is called the hypothalamo-spinal tract. Okay, now that we've covered the basics of this, remember I told you there's two functions of these nuclei. Anterior is parasympathetic, and then posterior is sympathetic activity. Well, there's another function. They're involved in thermal regulation. Let's talk about that really quickly. All right, so quickly, what I want to talk about is how the anterior, remember we said here? Let's talk about this here, the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. Remember we said that this is involved with parasympathetic nervous system. Well, guess what it's involved with? Thermal regulation. Now here's the way I like to remember this aspect of the thermal regulation. Parasympathetic is you're resting, you digesting, you're cooling down. You're cooling your body temperature down. So the job of the anterior hypothalamic nucleus is to what? To decrease your body temperature when it's necessary. So whenever your body temperature is too high or you just need to drop it a little bit. So how does your parasympathetic nervous system, or particularly your anterior hypothalamic nucleus, decrease your body temperature? There's two ways. One way is it causes vasodilation of your cutaneous vessels. So vasodilation of the cutaneous vessels, so the vessels within the skin. If you vasodilate your cutaneous vessels, you know blood is relatively warm. So if you dilate the vessels that are close to the skin surface, it's going to radiate some of that heat off of the skin surface, trying to cool your body down. So one of the ways that it does that is vasodilation of cutaneous vessels. The second way that you cool your body down is relatively straightforward. You have these little glands that can be stimulated, sweat glands, eccrine sweat glands. And what can they do? They can produce sweat, and that sweat will coat the skin. And whenever the heat hits that actual wet perspiration through a process called evaporative cooling, that also helps to cool the body down. So the second thing is sweating. That's another way that we can regulate our body temperature. And who is responsible for doing this? For sweating and cutaneous vasodilation. This is the responsibility of the anterior hypothalamic nucleus, which has parasympathetic function and decreasing your body temperature functions. Now come down to the next thing here. The next aspect here is going to be your posterior hypothalamic nucleus. Let's do this here in orange since we stuck with orange. Your posterior hypothalamic nucleus, what do we say about this son of a gun? The posterior hypothalamic nucleus is involved with sympathetic nervous system activities, and it is designed to do what? Well, your sympathetic is trying to increase your flight. It's trying to rev you up. So increasing your body temperature, revving up your body temperature, right? So it will increase your body temp. Well, how does it increase your body temperature, the posterior hypothalamic nucleus? It does it by doing the exact opposite of what we said here. instead of having the blood flow through the cutaneous vessels, it actually tries to prevent that. Squeeze those vessels like a son of a gun. And so what is that called? It's called vasoconstriction. And we're going to do that for the cutaneous blood vessels. If you constrict the vessels near the skin, that warm blood won't go to the skin and radiate that heat off of the body. That's going to be interesting. It shunts it to the actual internal organs. The other aspect, you know, whenever you shiver, it actually generates a little bit of heat. So shivering can also generate heat. And that can also help to increase your body temperature. All right, so these are the ways that your autonomic activity of the hypothalamus is occurring. So again, who does this actual process here? Just to recap it, the vasoconstriction and shivering. This is the job of the posterior hypothalamic nucleus, which has sympathetic and increasing body temperature functions. All right, so to quickly highlight, because sometimes this can be asked on exams, the names of the pathways are connections from the hypothalamus to other structures. What are some of those names? Now, one of the pathways that connects your amygdala to your hypothalamus is called the stria terminalis. Okay, this is a long pathway that connects the amygdala to the hypothalamus. The other one I mentioned is a really short pathway that connects the amygdala to the hypothalamus. We're not going to write this all out. It'll take forever. It's called the ventral amygdalofugal pathway. Okay, so that's connecting the amygdala to the hypothalamus. Remember, this is the limbic function of the hypothalamus. So connections between amygdala and hypothalamus is involved in limbic function. Hippocampus. This is also another limbic system structure, but it's involved with the memory. Amygdala is more the emotional and olfaction aspect. The hippocampus is connected to the hypothalamus, particularly the mammillary bodies, via the fornix. Okay? All right, so then you have another important connection that's involved in limbic types of activity. There's a connection between a part of the cerebral cortex. You have what's called the prefrontal cortex. And then you have another area here called the septal area, septal nuclei, near like the lamina terminalis. Not super important. What I want you to know is there's a connection between these structures and the hypothalamus, and there's also a connection between the reticular formation of the brainstem and the hypothalamus. And that connection between the reticular formation and primarily the prefrontal cortex, the connection between that and the hypothalamus is called the median forebrain bundle. Okay? So these are the connections for limbic functions between these following structures and the hypothalamus. Look at that, perfect spacing. All right. Next one is the connections that are involved with endocrine functions. Now remember, I told you there was a name of a tract. Remember we had the paraventricular nucleus, and then you had the supraoptic nucleus. They're nuclei within the hypothalamus, but their axons went down to the posterior pituitary. There's a special name for this tract. Do you guys know what this is called? It's called the hypothalamic, hypophyseal, tract. Okay? Then you have another connection here, and this is between the arcuate nucleus, remember that guy, and the anterior pituitary. And we called that connection here, the vascular connection between the two, the hypothalamic, hypophyseal portal system. And that's involved in the endocrine activity of the hypothalamus. Come into the autonomic functions or the connections of the hypothalamus. And again, these connections of the autonomic nervous system, what was this nucleus here in the hypothalamus that went to the sympathetic? This was our posterior hypothalamic nucleus, right? And the connection between the posterior hypothalamic nucleus and the T1 to L2 portion of the spinal cord. And remember, what is this portion of the spinal cord here? This is called your lateral gray horn. So the lateral gray horn, this connection is called the hypothalamo-spinal tract. Beautiful. Then the name of the tract that connected the, what is this nucleus? That's involved with parasympathetic. This is our anterior hypothalamic nucleus. And it connected to the cranial nerve nuclei and the sacral portion of the spinal cord. And then you had the connections from the nucleus of tractus solitarius back to the anterior hypothalamus. This whole bundle of tract is called the what? Dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. Beautiful. And that covers the hypothalamus. All right, Ninja Nerds, in this monster of a video where we covered so many things, I'm sorry, guys, but I hope it made sense. I really do. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you guys did learn a lot from this and understand a lot, I beg, plead, please hit that subscribe button, comment down in the comment section, like this video. Also, down in the description box, we have links to our Facebook, Instagram, Patreon. Go check that out. Follow us on Instagram and also on Facebook. And if you guys have the ability to donate on Patreon, we would truly appreciate it. All right, Ninja Nerds, as always, we thank you, love you, appreciate you, and until next time.